In the year 1184 or thereabouts, a boy named Temujin was living as a fugitive on the Mongolian steppe, wearing a wooden yoke around his neck as a captured slave, having already watched his father poisoned by rivals and his family abandoned by their own clan to starve on the open plain. He was, by any reasonable measure, at the very bottom of the world he'd been born into, with no clan protection, no inherited status, and no realistic path back to relevance by the rules that world operated on. Within 4 decades, that same boy would unify the warring tribes of the steppe and build the largest contiguous land empire in human history, stretching from the Pacific coast of China to the edge of Europe. This episode isn't an argument that Genghis Khan was a good man, and it won't try to become one by the end. The historical record on the violence of his campaigns is not in serious dispute, and this episode won't dispute it either. What's worth examining, carefully and without the sanitizing that his modern admirers sometimes apply, is the specific system of thought that took a starving outcast with every disadvantage his world could offer and turned him into the architect of an empire that outlasted him by a century and a half. The tribal system Temujin was born into Iran on a principle that had been unquestioned for centuries, that loyalty and rank followed bloodline, clan, and inherited status. A commander's son became a commander regardless of whether he could actually command. What Temujin did, as he began assembling his own following, was quietly discard that entire premise. He promoted based on demonstrated performance in battle and administration, regardless of a man's birth, his clan, or whether he had once been an enemy. Some of his most trusted generals had previously fought against him and were absorbed into his command structure once their loyalty and competence were proven. This was not sentimentality about second chances, and he was not, by any surviving account, a particularly forgiving man in general. It was a colder calculation that a system optimized for actual output would consistently outperform a system optimized for preserving existing hierarchy, and that almost every rival clan and rival empire around him was leaving enormous talent on the table, generation after generation, by refusing to look past pedigree, birth order, and inherited status when deciding who commanded and who obeyed. It would be dishonest to describe this only as an efficient meritocracy and stop there. The campaigns that this system enabled were catastrophic for the populations in their path. Cities that resisted were frequently destroyed outright, and historians estimate the Mongol conquests contributed to tens of millions of deaths across Asia and Eastern Europe, through direct violence, famine, and disease that followed in its wake. The same discipline that built the meritocratic command structure was deployed as a deliberate policy of terror, the calculated idea that a city destroyed as an example would make the next city surrender without a fight, saving Mongol soldiers and resources. This is the uncomfortable core of this entire episode. The system that rewarded talent regardless of origin, and the system that leveled cities as psychological warfare, were not separate impulses in Genghis Khan's thinking. They were the same cold, results-first logic, applied to 2 very different problems, one aimed at building his own army and the other aimed at breaking everyone else's will to resist it before a single arrow was fired. Strip away the violence for a moment, not to excuse it, but to isolate the single piece of this story that has survived as genuinely useful, and you're left with a fairly simple operating principle. Judge people by what they demonstrably produce, not by where they came from, who their family is, or what they've claimed about themselves. This sounds almost too obvious to be worth stating, until you notice how rarely most institutions, historical or modern, actually practice it with any consistency. Genghis Khan built an army and an administrative system out of Mongols, Chinese, Persians, and former enemies, unified not by ethnicity or shared history but by a ruthlessly consistent standard. Does this person perform? That consistency, applied across an empire that spanned wildly different cultures and languages, is a large part of why the system held together at all, long enough to outlast its founder by generations. You don't need an empire to run into the failure mode Genghis Khan identified. Almost every organization, family business, or long-running institution eventually starts confusing tenure, familiarity, or the right last name with actual capability. The founder's nephew gets the promotion the star employee earned. The person who's simply been around the longest gets deferred to on decisions they've never actually been good at. The specific discipline worth extracting here is the willingness to look directly at output, uncomfortable as that can be when it conflicts with loyalty, comfort, or history, and to promote, trust, and delegate accordingly. It's a colder way of operating than most people are naturally inclined toward, and that coldness is precisely why it was rare then and remains rare now. Here's an exercise worth trying this week. Identify one role, task, or decision in your life, at work, in a family situation, in any group you're part of, that has been assigned based on history, seniority, or comfort rather than demonstrated performance. Ask yourself honestly whether the person currently holding that role is actually the best available option for it, and whether you've been avoiding that question because the answer would be uncomfortable. You don't need to act on it immediately. Just notice where the gap exists. Genghis Khan built an empire partly by refusing to look away from that exact gap, even when the answer disrupted a system everyone else had simply accepted. What he did with that clarity afterward is its own separate, much darker discussion, one this episode hasn't tried to resolve for you. Next week, we'll look at a man whose name has become a synonym for ruthlessness, largely for reasons he'd argue almost nobody who invokes it has actually read. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.